When the podcast host casually leaned forward and asked Taehyung who Jungkook's soulmate really was, no one in the studio expected the air to collapse the way it did. It was supposed to be another viral question, another clipped moment designed for algorithms and trending tabs. The host even smiled when he asked it, half joking, half baiting, as if this were just another name to throw into a headline. Taehyung didn't answer. He sat perfectly still on the velvet couch, shoulders squared, eyes fixed somewhere just beyond the microphone. For a brief second, the room felt frozen. The soft hum of the studio lights seemed louder than before. Even the producer behind the glass stopped moving. The host cleared his throat, trying to lighten the mood, but Taehyung still didn't blink. His hands were folded in his lap, fingers interlocked so tightly the knuckles had turned pale. One heartbeat passed, then another. Then he exhaled through his nose, a sharp, controlled breath that sounded more like restraint than calm. "You want to know who Jungkook's soulmate is," Taehyung finally said. His voice cracked on the last word. It wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden breakdown, no raised voice, no shaking sobs. Instead, something far more unsettling happened. His jaw tightened, his lips parted slightly, and his eyes filled in silence. Tears welled up slowly, deliberately, as if his body had decided before his mind could stop it. The host's smile vanished instantly. Taehyung lifted a hand toward his face, not to wipe the tears, but as if to shield himself from the fact that they were there at all. His fingers hovered near his mouth, trembling just enough for the camera to catch it. When the first tear slipped free and traced down his cheek, the entire studio seemed to realize they had crossed a line. "I didn't think," the host began, then stopped. He leaned back in his chair, suddenly aware that this wasn't content anymore. This wasn't entertainment. This was something raw unfolding in real time. Taehyung laughed softly, but the sound was hollow, brittle, almost painful. "People talk about soulmates like it's a joke," he said, staring down at the floor now. "Like it's shipping, like it's fan service." Another tear fell. "But it's not," he continued, his voice low, steady only because he was forcing it to be. "It's not cute. It's not fun. It's waking up every day knowing someone exists in your life in a way you can't explain, can't claim, can't escape." The host swallowed hard. "Taehyung, I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I shouldn't have asked that." Taehyung shook his head once slowly. "No," he replied. "You asked the question everyone asks. You just asked it out loud." He wiped his face then, finally, dragging the back of his hand across his cheek like he was erasing evidence. His eyes were red, not with embarrassment but with exhaustion, the kind that comes from holding something in for too long. "Everyone wants an answer," he said. "They want a name, they want a headline, they want a story that fits in a caption." The screen behind them continued looping muted images from past performances. Concert stages, rehearsal rooms, backstage laughter frozen in time. One frame paused on Jungkook mid-smile, sweat on his brow, eyes bright with something that felt painfully familiar. "No one sees what happens when the cameras turn off," Taehyung went on. "No one hears the silence in hotel rooms. No one knows what it's like to sit 6 feet away from someone and feel like the distance is infinite." The host didn't interrupt this time. Taehyung looked up directly into the lens, not at the host, not at the crew, at the audience, at millions of strangers who would later replay this moment again and again. "You want to know who Jungkook's soulmate is," he repeated, softer now. "Maybe it's the person who knows his fears before he says them out loud. Maybe it's the person who recognizes his footsteps in a hallway. Maybe it's the one who stays silent so he doesn't have to." The room was completely still. "And maybe," Taehyung added, his voice barely above a whisper, "it was never meant to be someone who gets to say it." The host leaned forward, his voice shaking. "I really am sorry." Taehyung nodded, finally breaking eye contact with the camera. "It's okay," he said. "Someone needed to hear it, maybe even me." That was how the episode began. Unfiltered, unplanned, and irreversible. Within minutes of the podcast going live, clips of Taehyung's trembling voice and silent tears were already spreading across social media. Viewers weren't just watching anymore. They were dissecting every word, every pause, every breath. Hashtags began to climb. Screenshots froze his expression mid-tear. And somewhere far from the studio, Jungkook was watching too. He watched the moment Taehyung stopped smiling. He watched the moment the host apologized. And he knew, before anyone else did, that this question had just changed everything. He had been sitting alone in a quiet room, phone balanced against the edge of the table, replaying the clip even though every instinct told him to stop. Taehyung's voice still echoed in his ears, low and controlled, the kind of calm that only exists when someone is holding themselves together by force. Jungkook had heard that tone before, too many times. He pressed pause, then play again. The moment Taehyung's voice cracked, Jungkook looked away. Not because he didn't want to see it, but because he knew exactly what it meant. Taehyung never cried when it was safe. He cried when something had already gone too far to pull back. The comments were moving faster than Jungkook could read. Some were confused. Some were defensive. Some were painfully perceptive. People arguing over words like soulmate, debating tone and intention, freezing frames to analyze eye movements, lip tremors, the exact second Taehyung's breath faltered. But Jungkook wasn't watching the internet. He was watching Taehyung. He noticed the way Taehyung didn't say his name, the way he never once looked toward the looping images on the screen behind him, as if he already knew they would hurt too much. He noticed the smallest detail of all, the thing no comment section mentioned. The way Taehyung's shoulders dropped at the end, not in relief, but in surrender. Someone knocked on the door. Jungkook didn't answer. His phone buzzed again, this time with a message from a staff group chat that had suddenly gone silent for months and now wouldn't stop moving. Emergency meetings, statements being drafted, phones ringing nonstop. Everyone reacting, everyone panicking, everyone except the one person who mattered. Taehyung hadn't called. Jungkook stood up abruptly, packing the room. He ran a hand through his hair, breathing out hard, trying to ground himself. He told himself there were 1,000 reasons Taehyung might not be reaching out yet. Schedules, shock, the weight of what he just said out loud. But underneath all of that was a quieter truth Jungkook couldn't ignore. Taehyung had finally stopped protecting him. Across the city, Taehyung sat in the same studio long after the cameras were supposed to be off. The host had left first, then the crew, then the producers. Apologies had been offered, assurances given, all of them sounding distant and unreal. Taehyung nodded through most of it, without really hearing. When the room was finally empty, he stayed where he was, elbows resting on his knees, staring at the floor. His reflection stared back at him from the black screen of the camera monitor. Red eyes, tight mouth, a version of himself he usually hid carefully. He hadn't planned to say any of it. He had told himself before the recording that he would smile, deflect, joke like always. He had done it 100 times before. But something about the way the question was asked, the casual confidence that his feelings could be reduced to a soundbite, had cracked something open. And once it opened, it didn't stop. Taehyung pulled his phone from his pocket. He stared at Jungkook's name for a long moment, thumb hovering over the screen. He imagined Jungkook watching the clip, imagined the tightness in his chest, the way he would go quiet instead of angry. "I'm sorry," Taehyung whispered to no one. He didn't send the message. By the time Taehyung left the studio, the night air felt heavier than usual. His manager was waiting by the car, phone pressed to his ear, face pale. He ended the call the moment he saw Taehyung. "We need to talk," he said. Taehyung nodded once, "I know." What followed was a blur of words that felt rehearsed and urgent all at once. Headlines being drafted, clips going viral. The phrase damage control repeated like a warning bell. Taehyung listened quietly, eyes on the passing streetlights, absorbing every consequence without flinching. "What were you thinking?" his manager finally asked, not angrily, but with something closer to fear. Taehyung answered honestly, "I was." The car stopped at a red light. Taehyung's phone buzzed again. This time it was Jungkook. For a second, Taehyung couldn't breathe. He stared at the screen, heart pounding, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on his chest. He imagined Jungkook's voice, calm on the surface, fractured underneath. He answered. They didn't speak right away, just breathing on opposite ends of the line, both aware that once one of them talked, there would be no pretending left. "Did you mean it?" Jungkook asked finally. Taehyung closed his eyes. "You know I did." Another pause, longer this time. "You didn't have to do that," Jungkook said, not accusing, just tired. "You didn't have to say it like that." "I know," Taehyung replied, "but I couldn't keep lying." Jungkook laughed softly, humorless. "Funny. I thought I was the one protecting you all this time." Taehyung felt the words land exactly where they were meant to. "You were," he said, "and I was protecting you back. We just never admitted it." Outside the car window, the city moved on like nothing had happened. Traffic lights changed. People crossed streets. Life continuing, indifferent to the fact that two people were standing on the edge of something they couldn't name anymore. "Everyone asking me what it means," Jungkook said. "What you meant." Taehyung swallowed. "What do you think it means?" Silence stretched between them again, but this time it wasn't empty. It was full of memories, late nights, shared glances, words swallowed at the last second, choices made and unmade. "I think," Jungkook said slowly, "that you just said out loud what we've been circling for years." Taehyung let out a shaky breath. And now we have to decide what we do with it." The car pulled up in front of Taehyung's building. His manager glanced back at him, clearly trying to read his expression, but Taehyung was already somewhere else. "I don't want to hurt you," Taehyung said quietly into the phone. "You already did," Jungkook replied, "but not the way they think." Taehyung nodded even though Jungkook couldn't see it. "I'm tired of pretending," he said. "Aren't you?" On the other end of the line, Jungkook didn't answer right away. But when he did, his voice was steady. "Yes." And in that single word, Taehyung knew the hardest part hadn't been the question on the podcast. It was what came next. Because once the truth is spoken, it doesn't disappear. It waits. The word lingered between them long after Jungkook said it. "Yes." Taehyung sat in the back seat of the car, phone still pressed to his ear, the city lights blurring past the window like something he no longer belonged to. That single answer carried more weight than any confession either of them had ever avoided. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. But it was final. Neither of them hung up right away. "What happens now?" Taehyung asked, his voice quieter than he intended. Jungkook exhaled slowly on the other end of the line. "Now everyone thinks they know our story," he said, "and none of them do." Taehyung closed his eyes. He could already picture it. Reaction videos, articles twisting tone and intent, people arguing over whether tears meant truth or manipulation. The internet didn't know how to sit with ambiguity, and he had just handed it something that couldn't be neatly labeled. By the time the car pulled away again, Taehyung had stopped listening to his manager entirely. The words blurred into noise. All he could hear was Jungkook breathing, steady but strained, like he was holding something back too. "I'm coming to see you," Jungkook said suddenly. Taehyung's eyes snapped open. "Now?" "Yes." There was no hesitation in his voice this time, no careful spacing of words, just certainty. "You shouldn't," Taehyung replied instinctively. "It's already chaos. Cameras are everywhere." "I don't care," Jungkook said. "I don't want to have this conversation through a screen." The car slowed near Taehyung's building. Outside, Two unfamiliar figures stood near the entrance, phones angled a little too deliberately. Taehyung's stomach tightened. "Jungkook," he said carefully, "think about this." "I have," Jungkook replied, "for years." The line went dead before Taehyung could respond. Inside his apartment, the silence felt unnatural. Taehyung dropped his keys onto the counter and leaned back against it, staring at the ceiling like it might give him instructions. His phone buzzed again and again with notifications he refused to open. He replayed the moment in the studio in his head, the host's face when he started crying, the way the room had gone still, the instant regret in everyone else's eyes, like they realized they couldn't put this back where it came from. For the first time, Taehyung wondered if he had taken something from Jungkook without asking. Not love, not truth, but timing. The knock came less than an hour later. Taehyung didn't need to check the door camera to know who it was. When he opened it, Jungkook stood there in a black hoodie, cap pulled low, mask covering half his face. His eyes were sharp and tired at the same time. The hallway light cast shadows under them that made him look older than he was. They stared at each other for a long second, both aware that this was the first time they'd been alone together since the podcast aired. Neither smiled. "You watched it," Taehyung said. Jungkook nodded, twice. "I'm sorry," Taehyung said immediately. "I didn't mean to." Jungkook stepped inside and shut the door behind him. "Don't," he said softly. "Don't turn this into something you apologize for just to make me feel better." Taehyung swallowed. "Then tell me what you feel." Jungkook leaned back against the door, arms crossed, eyes locked on Taehyung. "I feel exposed," he said. "Not because of them, because of you." Taehyung didn't look away. "You said everything except my name," Jungkook continued, "and somehow that made it louder." "I didn't want to trap you," Taehyung replied. "I didn't want to decide something for you on camera." Jungkook's lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. "You already did, just not the way you think." The room was quiet except for the distant hum of traffic outside. They stood a few feet apart, close enough to feel each other's presence, far enough to pretend there was still distance. "Everyone thinks this is about soulmates," Jungkook said. "They think that word is the story." "And it's not," Taehyung replied. "No," Jungkook agreed, "it's about choice." Taehyung felt his chest tighten. "I chose to stop lying." "And I'm choosing whether I'm ready to be seen," Jungkook said. "Those aren't the same thing." The words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. "I don't want you to lose anything because of me," Taehyung said quietly. Jungkook laughed under his breath. "I've been losing things slowly for years. You just sped it up." That finally broke something in Taehyung. He stepped forward, stopping just short of touching Jungkook. "I was drowning," he said, "and I didn't know how to ask for air without dragging you under with me." Jungkook's gaze softened. "You never dragged me," he said. "I was already there." Another silence settled between them, but this one felt different. Not heavy, expectant. "People are going to want answers," Jungkook said eventually. "They're already asking if I'm angry, if I feel betrayed." "Do you?" Taehyung asked. Jungkook shook his head. "No, I feel scared and relieved and furious that it took something like that for us to finally stop pretending." Taehyung nodded slowly. "Same." Outside, a car horn blared. Somewhere else in the city, someone was writing a headline that would never capture this moment correctly. "So what do we do?" Taehyung asked. Jungkook looked at him for a long time before answering. "We don't rush," he said. "We don't let them decide the meaning before we do." "And if they force it?" Taehyung asked. Jungkook's jaw tightened. "Then we decide whether silence is still protecting us or just hurting us." He reached out then, not to grab Taehyung's hand, not to make a statement, but just to rest his fingers briefly against Taehyung's wrist. A grounding touch, real, private. "For now," Jungkook added, "we breathe." Taehyung nodded, heart pounding. "For now." Neither of them knew how long for now would last. They only knew that once something this honest enters the world, it doesn't disappear quietly. It waits, and it grows. Morning arrived without permission. Taehyung woke to the sound of his phone vibrating non-stop on the table beside the couch. For a split second, he forgot where he was, forgot what had happened, forgot why his chest felt so tight. Then he saw Jungkook sitting on the floor across from him, back against the wall, head tilted forward, eyes already open. Neither of them had slept much. The air between them was thick with unfinished thoughts, the kind that linger after a conversation that changes something fundamental. Jungkook picked up his phone, glanced at the screen, and let out a slow breath. "It's everywhere," he said quietly. Taehyung didn't ask what it meant. He already knew. He reached for his own phone and immediately regretted it. Headlines stacked on top of each other, all screaming variations of the same question. Speculation disguised as certainty. Clips cropped to remove context. Thumbnails frozen on the exact second his tears had fallen. Taehyung breaks down on podcast after Jungkook Soulmate question. Host forced to apologize as idol loses composure. What Taehyung's tears really mean. Taehyung set the phone down face up on the table, as if refusing to look would somehow slow it all down. "This is my fault," he said. Jungkook shook his head immediately. "No," he replied. "This is what happens when people finally see something real. They don't know how to handle it." Taehyung studied Jungkook's face, searching for signs of regret, resentment, anything that would tell him he'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Instead, he saw tension, fear, and underneath it something steadier. Resolve. A knock sounded at the door. Both of them froze. Jungkook stood first, peering through the peephole. His shoulders dropped slightly. "It's staff," he said. "Management." Taehyung's stomach tightened. "Already." "They didn't wait," Jungkook replied. When the door opened, the apartment filled with voices that felt too loud for the space. Apologies mixed with warnings. Reassurance tangled with panic. Everyone spoke carefully, as if afraid the wrong word might trigger another uncontrollable moment. "We need to stabilize this," one of them said. "There's a meeting in an hour." "Statements are being drafted," another added. "We can frame this as emotional misunderstanding, stress, exhaustion." Taehyung listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. "And Jungkook," the manager continued, turning to him, "we need to know where you stand before this goes any further." Jungkook didn't answer right away. He looked at Taehyung instead. The room seemed to hold its breath. "I stand where I've always stood," Jungkook said calmly. "I just haven't said it out loud." That wasn't the answer they wanted. Silence followed, heavy and uncomfortable. Someone cleared their throat. Someone else checked their phone like they were looking for an escape. "This isn't about standing," the manager said carefully. "It's about damage control." Taehyung finally spoke. "You keep calling it damage," he said, "but you're only worried because people saw us without a filter." "That filter exists for a reason," the manager replied. Jungkook's voice sharpened. "Whose reason?" No one answered. After they left, the apartment felt smaller than before, like the walls had moved closer. Taehyung sat back down on the couch, running a hand through his hair. "They're going to push you to distance yourself," he said, "from me." Jungkook didn't deny it. "I know." "And if you do?" Taehyung asked, not accusing, just asking. Jungkook met his gaze. "Then I lose either way." The honesty of that made Taehyung's chest ache. Later that afternoon, the host released a short statement, an apology, carefully worded, respectful, acknowledging that the question had crossed a line. It only fueled the fire. People interpreted it as confirmation that something forbidden had been exposed. The narrative had already escaped everyone's control. By evening, Taehyung and Jungkook sat side by side in the car on the way to the building where the emergency meeting was being held. Neither spoke. The city outside looked the same as always, unaware that two people inside one car were about to have their lives reorganized by strangers. Inside the conference room, the atmosphere was cold and calculated. Screens displayed engagement metrics, sentiment graphs, projected losses, potential backlash scenarios. Taehyung stared at the numbers, feeling strangely disconnected from them. None of those graphs showed what it felt like to cry without intending to. None of them measured years of silence. "This is bigger than a podcast moment," one executive said. "This could affect everything." Jungkook leaned forward. "It already has." They discussed options: temporary silence, carefully controlled appearances, avoiding each other in public, reframing the narrative until it became unrecognizable. Taehyung listened, then shook his head slowly. "If we do that," he said, "then that moment meant nothing." The room went quiet. Jungkook nodded. "And I'm not willing to pretend it didn't happen." Someone sighed. Someone else whispered something under their breath. "You're asking us to take a risk," an executive said. "No," Jungkook replied. "We're asking you to stop making us lie." When they finally left the building, it was dark. The city lights reflected off the car windows, fractured and distant. Taehyung leaned his head back against the seat, exhausted in a way sleep wouldn't fix. "Do you regret it?" Jungkook asked softly. Taehyung thought about the studio, the tears, the apology, the way something heavy had finally lifted the moment he stopped holding it in. "No," he said, "I'm just scared of what comes next." Jungkook nodded. "Me too." He reached over then, resting his hand on Taehyung's knee for just a second. Not for cameras, not for reassurance, just to say he was there. Outside, the world kept watching, guessing, projecting. Inside the car, two people sat quietly, knowing that the hardest part wasn't being seen. It was deciding what to do once you were. The following days blurred into a rhythm neither of them had practiced before. Silence became strategy. Taehyung stayed off social media entirely, his phone handed over to staff except for a single contact that still came through unfiltered. Jungkook did the opposite. He watched everything, read everything, not out of masochism, but out of a need to understand the shape of the storm before deciding how to walk through it. They didn't appear together. They didn't deny anything either. And that, somehow, unsettled people more than a statement ever could. The absence of explanation created a vacuum, and the world rushed to fill it. Every old clip resurfaced with new captions. Every shared glance from years ago was suddenly treated like evidence. Moments that had once passed unnoticed were now dissected with surgical intensity. "What did we miss?" people asked. Taehyung sat by the window of his apartment late one night, city lights glowing below, watching the reflection of his own face in the glass. He barely recognized himself, not because he looked different, but because he felt lighter and heavier at the same time. He picked up his phone and typed a message to Jungkook. "Are you okay?" The reply came almost instantly. "I don't know yet, but I'm not running." Taehyung closed his eyes, letting that sink in. They met again 3 days later quietly in a place that held no cameras and no expectations. A small rehearsal room they both knew well, one that had seen laughter, frustration, and exhaustion over the years. It felt neutral, safe. Jungkook arrived first this time. He was standing in the middle of the room when Taehyung walked in, hands in his pockets, posture stiff but deliberate. "You look tired," Taehyung said. Jungkook smiled faintly. "So do you." They sat on the floor, backs against the mirror, not looking at their reflections. For a while, neither spoke. The silence wasn't awkward. It was careful. "They want me to clarify," Jungkook said eventually. "Not deny, not confirm, clarify." Taehyung nodded. "They want to put it back in a box." "They want me to say I was misunderstood," Jungkook continued. "That your emotions were about pressure, that the question crossed a line and that's the end of it." "And is it?" Taehyung asked. Jungkook didn't answer right away. "No," he said finally, but saying that out loud would change things permanently. Taehyung turned his head to look at him. "Some things already are." Jungkook met his gaze. "That's what scares me." Taehyung understood. Fear didn't mean doubt, it meant awareness. "I don't need you to speak for me," Taehyung said quietly. "I don't need you to explain my tears." "I know," Jungkook replied, "but I need to decide whether I'm still hiding because it protects us or because it protects everyone else." That question hung in the air, unanswered. Later that night, Jungkook recorded a message on his phone. Not a statement, not something meant for release. Just his own voice, steady but unfiltered. "I'm not angry," he said. "I'm not confused. I'm just done pretending that things don't matter because they make people uncomfortable." He didn't post it. Not yet. The host's apology continued to circulate, and with it came a shift in tone. Less mockery, more discomfort. People began asking not what Taehyung had meant, but why the question had been asked at all. Boundaries were suddenly part of the conversation. That alone felt like a small, unexpected victory. One evening, Taehyung received a call from someone he hadn't heard from in a long time. An old acquaintance from before the spotlight had reshaped everything. "I saw the clip," the voice said gently. "I just wanted to say it was brave." Taehyung thanked them and hung up, staring at the wall long after the call ended. Brave wasn't a word he would have chosen. Honest felt closer. Unavoidable, maybe. When Jungkook came over later, Taehyung told him about the call. "Do you feel brave?" Jungkook asked. Taehyung shook his head. "I feel tired of carrying things alone." Jungkook sat beside him close enough that their shoulders touched. "Then don't," he said. That simple sentence landed harder than any headline. As the week drew to a close, the pressure didn't disappear, but it changed shape. Less explosive, more watchful, people waited. For Jungkook. For a signal. He stood in front of the mirror on the morning of a scheduled appearance, adjusting the collar of his jacket, expression unreadable. Taehyung watched from the couch, trying not to project his own fear onto him. "You don't owe anyone anything," Taehyung said. Jungkook nodded. "I know." He paused, then added, "But I owe myself the truth." On stage, the lights were bright but familiar. Jungkook answered questions about music, about schedules, about the future. And then, inevitably, it came. A careful question, respectful, measured. "About the podcast." The room went still. Jungkook didn't look to the side, didn't laugh it off. He took a breath. "What Taehyung felt was real," he said calmly. "And I think people should ask themselves why seeing real emotion makes them uncomfortable." That was all. No labels, no definitions, no denial. When Taehyung watched the clip later, his hands trembled just slightly. Jungkook hadn't explained them. He had stood with him. And in that moment, Taehyung realized something he hadn't let himself believe before. The hardest part wasn't the question on the podcast. It wasn't the tears. It was choosing not to hide afterward. And that choice, once made, changes everything. The reaction was immediate, but not explosive. That surprised everyone. Instead of outrage, there was a pause, an audible hesitation in the collective voice of the internet. Jungkook's words didn't feed speculation. They didn't confirm or deny anything people could argue over endlessly. They redirected the focus, and in doing so, quietly dismantled the game. Why does real emotion make people uncomfortable? That question lingered far longer than any headline. Taehyung watched the clip alone, sitting on the edge of his bed, phone held loosely in his hand. When Jungkook finished speaking, Taehyung didn't cry. He didn't smile either. He simply exhaled, long and deep, like someone who had been bracing for impact and instead felt the ground steady beneath his feet. For the first time since the podcast, he didn't feel exposed. He felt backed. Messages poured in, not the loud public kind but private ones. Industry peers, seniors, people who understood the cost of staying vague and the courage of staying human. Many said the same thing in different ways. You didn't make it worse. You made it honest. Jungkook came over that night without saying much. No disguises this time. Just a cap pulled low and a quiet knock at the door. When Taehyung opened it, they stood facing each other for a moment, both visibly exhausted. "You didn't have to do that," Taehyung said. "I know," Jungkook replied. "I wanted to." They sat on the floor again, backs against the couch, a familiar posture now. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows, mooting the city into something almost peaceful. "I was scared," Jungkook admitted. "Not of what people would think, of what would happen if I didn't say anything." Taehyung nodded. "Silence can be louder than words." "And heavier," Jungkook added. The days that followed didn't suddenly become easy. Schedules adjusted. Appearances were reconsidered. Conversations behind closed doors grew more careful, more deliberate, but something fundamental had shifted. They were no longer reacting. They were choosing. Taehyung noticed it in small moments. The way staff stopped urging him to smile through discomfort. The way questions during interviews softened, boundaries more clearly drawn. The way Jungkook stood a little straighter, spoke a little slower, as if no longer splitting himself in two. One afternoon, Taehyung found himself back in a recording studio, alone this time. He stood in front of the microphone, headphones resting around his neck, staring at his reflection in the glass. For years, he had sung about longing without naming it, about connection without defining it, about love as something abstract and safe. Now it felt different. When he finally recorded the take, his voice was steady, not restrained, not careful, just present. Jungkook listened later, sitting beside him in the control room. He didn't say anything when the track ended. He didn't need to. "That's new," Jungkook said eventually. Taehyung nodded. "It's what happens when you stop pretending the song isn't about anything." Outside the studio, the narrative continued to evolve. The host's apology became a footnote instead of the focus. Discussions shifted toward responsibility, about questions asked for clicks rather than care, about emotional labor disguised as entertainment. Taehyung hadn't intended to start that conversation. But he didn't step away from it either. One evening, while scrolling aimlessly, he came across a comment buried deep in a thread. "I don't know what their relationship is, but I know I've never seen honesty like that on a podcast before." Taehyung stared at the screen for a long moment before locking his phone and setting it aside. Later that night, lying on opposite ends of the couch, lights off, voices low, Jungkook spoke into the dark. "Do you ever think about what happens if we keep choosing this?" he asked. Taehyung knew what he meant. Not headlines, not rumors. Visibility. "Yes," Taehyung said, "all the time. And I think it's still less painful than disappearing inside ourselves." Jungkook turned his head, eyes catching the faint glow from the street outside. "Me too." They didn't make promises. They didn't name things. They didn't need to. What mattered was that neither of them felt alone in the wait anymore. Outside, the world continued to speculate, to guess, to project meaning onto moments that weren't theirs to define. Inside that quiet room, two people rested in a rare and fragile truth. Not everything had to be said at once, but nothing would be buried again. And that, more than any apology, any clip, any headline, was the real turning point. Because once you choose honesty over comfort, there is no going back. Only forward.